Alright guys, we are up to topic 8.3, the so-called Red Scare. This might be appropriately better known as the second Red Scare, however, because we had a first one back in the context of World War I in the 1920s. This is going to be a much shorter video than our last one. Not that it's not important, it's very important actually, but there's just less dense content to get through. So let's get this going, and we're going to talk a lot about people like the Rosenbergs and Nixon and Joseph McCarthy in our video today. So let's figure out what were the causes and effects of this second Red Scare. And, well, it's obviously the Cold War, right? We've got to figure out where we stand with the Soviets and whether or not they are infiltrating our government, whether or not they're spies or roaming around causing problems. And if you suspect they are, you've got to go after them. And that's known as red hunting. All right, so we feared that our government had been basically riddled with communist spies and communist sympathizers who were either passing information on to the Soviets or were doing things to weaken our government and make it less efficient and kind of prepare for a Soviet overtaking of the economy. Now, this was a balance of paranoia, where it's not really backed up by any fact, and then there was actually some real cause to be very concerned. There were, in fact, a number of Soviet spies and a number of communist sympathizers in the government who were very willing to assist the Soviets, and they really thought communism was kind of the future, and they thought they were going to be helping this future out. Now, again, what was it to the number that requires this massive campaign to root out suspected communists? Well, that's for historians to decide, I guess. Now, we're going to look at a couple of examples of this red hunting, and we're going to begin back under President Truman. So we're going to turn back the clock a little bit, back to his administration. And the thing about politicians during the Cold War, especially the early Cold War, is the last thing you want to do is appear weak on the issue of communists. Okay, you had to be strong anti-communist, which means you had to do something very active to point to and say, well, see, I'm doing this. This is what I'm doing to take out the communists. And so Truman authorizes this thing called the Loyalty Review Board. And over 3 million federal employees are going to be investigated and questioned and kind of checked up to see if they're truly loyal to the United States. Of the 3 million, about 3,000 would in fact be fired. So not exactly a big turnout in terms of finding disloyal people, but nonetheless it shows that America was concerned that the government was infested with communists. Loyalty oaths also become a pretty common practice in the 1940s and 50s. This was, in other words, you would have to take a loyalty oath as a condition of employment. I pledge my loyalty to America, to the Constitution. I promise I won't, help the Soviets out or anything like that. This was especially problematic for teachers. Teachers were pretty aggressively investigated and given loyalty oaths because the fear was that because teachers have so much influence over their students that they could be, in fact, indoctrinating their students and turning them into little communists who would one day sort of, grow up and want to destroy America. All right, our next big organization is called the House Committee on Un-American Activities, better known by its initials HUAC. And in 1948, a guy from California, you may have heard of before, Richard Milhouse Nixon, becomes a national figure when he leads the investigation of a guy named Alger Hiss. So Richard Nixon in charge of the HUAC investigation of Alger Hiss, and you're thinking, well, who in the heck is Alger Hiss, right? Who is this guy? Well, he had been part of the FDR administration back in the New Deal era. And remember, the New Deal had elements that people criticize as being too socialistic and maybe even communistic. And now that the Cold War is really starting to take off, people look back and think, well, gosh, were these guys in fact communists, infiltrating the government and changing the government under the guise of ending the Great Depression? And so there's an investigation of quite a few of these people. Now, being a communist is not a crime. Even in America, it's not a crime. But during the investigation, Hiss did in fact perjure himself by making false claims under oath, and he was found out, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. And this is going to be one of Nixon's big moments, you know, in terms of a young politician trying to make a name for himself. This is where he got the reputation of being a really rabid red hunter, going out there and finding the commies and rooting them out. 1951 comes the case of the Rosenbergs. So Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were charged and convicted of supplying nuclear and other classified data to the Soviets. Now, what's the background on this? So Julius had worked in various top secret programs, scientific programs as an engineer, and he did have some, you know, communist leanings of sorts, I guess. And so he had been acting as a courier and giving information of the Soviet to their spies and informants, whatnot. And he was found out, and he was arrested and convicted. Now, this is an example of espionage, and the Constitution is very clear. Espionage can carry with it a death penalty. And so what to do with the Rosenbergs was the big question. And the punishment will, in fact, be the death penalty. So in 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed by electric chair. Now, at the time, there was a huge outcry about this, particularly from people on kind of the left end of the spectrum. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. One, some people felt that this was totally made up, that this is just kind of an example of people being hunted out of feelings of paranoia, and perhaps their Jewish ancestry and culture may have played a role in this. And I know there was, put simply, maybe this is an example of anti-Semitism kind of rising up during the Cold War. Some people thought that even if they had been guilty, that putting them to death was extreme, and they also had children who would become orphans because of this, and so maybe they should, something lesser than death. And, for many decades, that was kind of where it sat. There were people on both sides. It's kind of like the Sacco and Vanzetti trial from the 1920s. People who felt that these people, the Rosenbergs, were given a really unfair trial and unfair punishment. Now, once the Cold War was over and a lot of Soviet archives were opened up for the first time, it turns out that, in fact, the Rosenbergs were guilty of supplying information to the Soviets. Now, again, whether or not that deserves the death penalty is something we could debate, but the fact is that America was really worried about this stuff in the 1950s, and so the Rosenbergs really pay the price for their activities. All right, speaking of red hunting, the number one red hunter in American history is none other than Joseph McCarthy. And if you've never heard of him, maybe you've heard of McCarthyism, and if you haven't heard of that, that's fine. We're going to cover that right now. So let's talk about this guy's rise to power. So in 1946, he is elected to the Senate from Wisconsin. And part of this was he really exaggerated his war record in World War II, and he called himself Tail Gunner Joe, and he tried to portray himself as this guy who had really been in danger and had been injured, and all this war hero stuff that had been greatly inflated. I mean, he was a World War II veteran, and he did do some combat flights, but it wasn't nearly to the level he was playing up to get votes. So he's got kind of a sleazy side going into all this stuff. And then in 1950, with the second Red Scare really heating up, McCarthy decides to try to ride that second Red Scare to greater political power and prestige. The way he's going to do this is publicly accuse our Secretary of State at the time, State Acheson, of knowingly employing 205 communists in the State Department. Now, this is an absolute bombshell accusation, that our Secretary of State would knowingly have communists working in the State Department, because the State Department handles negotiations and diplomacy with other countries. So in theory, if the communists were in the State Department, they might craft pro-Soviet policy that would weaken the United States and help the Soviets. So again, this is a bombshell accusation. And of course, when you accuse somebody of something this serious, you better have something to back that accusation up. And McCarthy didn't. And by the way, the number of communists he says were employed in the U.S. government varied all the time. He would quote different numbers every other time, and he would never show anyone his list of names. It was just this blanket accusation. And that was enough to get a lot of headlines, of course, in the Red Scare, right? Just accusing someone of being a communist was basically tantamount to them being a communist. And people lost jobs, people lost friends, people had their reputations thrown in the trash. I mean, this was bad stuff, to accuse people with really no base that they're a communist, knowing the damage that would actually inflict on that person is pretty awful stuff. And this is what we know as McCarthyism, where you're just kind of naming names and you're going on this crusade to conduct a witch hunt to help you to gain power and prestige, and you really don't care about who you are harming in the process. Now, early on in McCarthy's crusade, he had the backing of most Americans. Americans felt that he was doing the right thing because they'd convinced themselves that, in fact, communists were riddled throughout the government, and so they were willing to overlook some of his pretty awful methods, honestly, of just throwing out these accusations left and right. McCarthy eventually is going to fall from people's grace, however, and this occurs starting in the spring of 1954. He's going to take to television, and television is really a new medium of approaching and talking to the American people. And what he's going to do is, for 35 days, he's going to have these trials in which he goes after everybody in the U.S. government, even going so far as to attack the loyalty of the U.S. Army, accusing it of being full of communist plotters and sympathizers and spies. He goes after George Marshall, the guy who came up with the Marshall Plan, had been our chief military officer in World War II. And he really starts to go off the deep end. And people begin to turn against McCarthy because, again, he's not really bringing any proof to the table. It's just accusation after accusation. It's mudslinging. It's hyperbole, but no real evidence. He's not actually uncovering any communists at all. And by December of 1954, it all just comes crashing down, and the Senate is embarrassed of him. And of course, there's also a fear in the Senate that they might be the next person named, and so we better take this guy out while we can before he takes the rest of us out. It's kind of similar to what happened with Robespierre in the French Revolution and during the Reign of Terror. Eventually, people were so afraid of him that they decided they had to kill him before they killed him. They had to kill him, before they killed their accusers. So this was really a fight for survival. And McCarthy was called out and censured and condemned by the Senate as conduct unbecoming of a member, and his career basically was finished at that point. And he had already been an alcoholic, and he turned to the bottle even more. And just 3 years later, he died from complications from alcoholism. So a very quick rise and a very quick fall for, I almost said Douglas MacArthur, for Joseph McCarthy. All right, guys, that is pretty much it for the Red Scare. It's a very important moment in American history, guys, and don't forget there are parallels back to the first Red Scare after World War I. So look back at those two events and be able to compare and contrast them.